This is so exciting for me. First of all, it's so thrilling to be back in Boulder. I was here last year for the Jaipur launch, and I got the privilege this year of bringing my fantastic editor, Sarah Crichton, and having her come from New York to tell us the secrets of publishing, being a genius editor, and what it's like to have your own imprint at Farrar Straus. And with her is, of course, well, let me stay on Sarah. Sarah, if you go to your bookshelf and look, you will probably see a dozen books that say Sarah Crichton Books, Farrar Straus. Sarah's imprint is a hallowed brand. I am lucky enough to have her as my editor. She's been the culture editor of Newsweek, the editor of 17, the co-author with Marianne Pearl, Daniel Pearl's widow, of A Mighty Heart, later made into a movie starring Angelina Jolie, who's in the news, and more on that later. As a mark, but this is a panel in which we're going to celebrate originality, creation, the joy of invention, and literature. And as a mark of Sarah's originality, here is what she wrote in a culture diary that was published in the Paris Review a few years ago, just one tiny entry of the microscopic aspects of a culturate's day. 9:02 a.m. on the subway. Should read the proposals in my book bag that was supposed to read over the weekend, but instead played Brick Breaker on my BlackBerry the whole way. The action on my BlackBerry ball is getting jagged. It is like playing tennis with a warped racket. And speaking of an original, it is hard to top Dominic Smith, the best-selling, amazing writer, also edited by Sarah, and his shimmering book, The Last Painting of Sarah DeVos. In it, Dominic enters the mind and imaginations of every character he writes about, from an ambitious young scholar turned art forger to a 17th century Dutch woman painter. He pulls us into New York in the 1950s, to Amsterdam in the 1600s, to Sydney in the year 2000. I think this is my favorite novel of the last few years. I sat on it. I started the book about a week or two ago. I sat on my chair. I did not get up from that chair for 6 hours. And I met Dominic for the first time last night after falling in love with his novel and circling so many passages that you must know that your book now looks like a kind of college textbook for me. And we have Boulder's impresario of literature, the radio star Arsen Kashkashian. Walk into the Wunderkammer, which is Boulder Books, and you will walk out with bags and bags. I know from my last trip to Boulder. Arsen, your windows should get their own award. He has won awards as the nation's premier independent bookseller. So Arsen, welcome. We're thrilled, and Dominic and Sarah are thrilled to be on the panel with you. But let's start the panel where everything starts in a panel about books, with the word itself. So Dominic, let's plunge in.
Okay.
You have, I don't know, just this incredible genius for entering the inner life of characters who are as diverse as the photographer Louis Daguerre, to this book with your 17th century incredible Sarah DeVos. I was reading John le Carré's memoir in the last couple of weeks, and he mentioned that he had entered George Smiley's inner life by having an Oxford Don that he based that inner life on. So I became so captivated by the idea of how does a novelist penetrate the inner life of his character. So where and how did Sarah DeVos start for you?
Yeah, there's a couple answers to that. By the way, I'm going to tell my wife you called me an incredible genius. I've filed that away. So this book took root 15 years ago when I lived in Amsterdam for a year. And it was my first contact with the Dutch Golden Age up close. And there were a couple revelations about that. One of them had to do with discovering that there were actually women painters of the 17th century during the Dutch Golden Age. And why hadn't I heard of any of them? And in fact, there were about 25 women who were admitted to a guild of St. Luke, the main painters' guild in the 17th century. And a small handful of them have surviving works. And one of them is a woman named Judith Leister. And in terms of the beating pulse of this novel, it really kind of grabbed me by the collar when I saw a painting that Judith Leister had done in the 1630s, and it's her self-portrait. It's in the National Gallery in Washington. It's worth Googling after this panel. And what was striking is that as I looked at this painting, it was something that she probably put together to be admitted to the Guild of St. Luke. And it was just this beautiful self-portrait of her looking at the viewer with this very warm, very immediate gaze. And she's dressed very formally in front of her easel, and she's holding her palette and her brushes. But it's the counterpoint of that visual image, which is that she was lost for 200 years in the art history record. And when she was rediscovered, it was completely by accident. These two London art dealers had a squabble about the value of a painting that had been attributed to Frans Hals for a century, and that painting turned out to be a Judith Leister. And so the irony of her rediscovery was that instead of the painting kind of announcing this rediscovered, incredible painter of the 17th century, the value of the painting went down by 25%. And that was where I started to get really very interested in trying to write a novel that comes out of the gaps and the silences in art history, and that's how Sarah DeVos came along.
So, but as you discover that painting, there's an incredible sort of amount of detective work. So, do you stand in front of? Do you get a vision? Do you enter her imagination as you look at that face?
No, it's much less mystical than that. There are no visions. There are subject matter experts. So my undergrad degree is in anthropology, and so one of the things that gives me is a sense of writing a novel as a kind of field work. And so I try to find subject matter experts who are willing to talk to me. For this book, there was an art restoration expert at the National Gallery of Canada. There was a female historian who specializes in Judith Leister, and then there was a fleeting email correspondence with an art forger. And these three people together were kind of my go-to experts. And that's how, for me as a writer, I can get into those heads.
Okay, but wait a minute. You're such an intrepid researcher, and you've just kind of glossed over a detail that I think we'd like to stay on a little bit. You had a fleeting email correspondence
Doesn't everybody?
with an art forger. Yeah. Doesn't everybody, said Dominic. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so
Dominic, tell all.
So some backstory
Who,
on this.
what, when, where,
okay.
how?
So he's a fascinating fellow named Ken Perenni, and he had a couple decades of a career as a master forger. He forged various time periods, early American, Renaissance, Dutch Golden Age, very successful, made a lot of money. But he always suspected that he was about to be caught. And in fact, he was about to be caught. The FBI has an art crimes unit, and they had been trying to have conclusive proof for a long time of his forgery and his crimes. And so he was a very cunning fellow, so what he decided to do was stop forging paintings, wait for the statute of limitations to run out on all his art crimes, and then naturally write a tell-all memoir about it, in which he described exactly how he committed these forgeries. So
America is a great country, let's face it.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And so early on, I read this memoir called Caveat Emptor, Buyer Beware, and it was full of these rich details about forgery. So out of the blue, I emailed him, and I asked him to authenticate, and the irony was not lost on me, authenticate the forgery methods that I'd used in my book. And a couple days later, he wrote me back, and he said, sure, send them to me. And so I sent him a list of the kind of 25 different techniques I'd used in the book, and he was good with about 18 of them. The others he called amateurish, and kind of enlightened me, and you know, it was a fun but also surreal email exchange, because here I was asking this master of deceit to authenticate a fictional painting by a fictional character.
But
But in
your
Perenni's world, that
character-
made total sense, apparently.
Your wonderful main character, Emily.
Ellie.
Ellie.
Mhm.
Ellie.
Yep.
I keep wanting to call her Emily. Why is that? So Emily is she's a sort of scholar, and she falls into this. She's trying to learn art restoration. She's experimenting with sand to get like 17th century techniques. How did you come up with her?
So one of the things that happens if you're a historical novelist and you spend enough time in archives and talking to people, you get obsessed with these little details that you're convinced are going to make or break your novel, right? And so one of those details was about the history of lead tin yellow, which is in the book, which, like Judith Leister, who was lost for 200 years, it was the main bright yellow of the 17th century, and yet it disappeared for 200 years and no one could remember how to make it. So I wanted to use that, and the sand and the use of yellow comes in with that. So often I'm like a magpie. I collect things and I want to put them in the book, and they either work or they don't.
And you use this kind of hall of mirrors, as we heard in the last session about epics, this kind of mirror structure. You know, Amsterdam 1600s, New York in the 50s, Sydney in 2000. So what was the reason for that? Why why New York in the 1950s? Why Sydney year 2000? And why Amsterdam in that golden tulip age?
So I don't think I knew that until, I knew I wanted a big time span. One of the themes I wanted to explore was the way that there's something timeless about art, and art, in this case, a painting, can be handed down in the same family for more than 3 centuries, and I wanted to see that over time. But later in the book, I realized that in some ways, each period is its own kind of golden age.
So
and so,
interesting.
you have the 17th century golden age. 1950s America was obviously, it had a dark underbelly, but it was also the height of consumer optimism and post-World War II exuberance. And then, weirdly, Sydney in the year 2000, right before the Olympics, kind of swelled with all of this patriotic fervor, and people felt like they were really at the center of the world in a way that seemed remarkable. So I kind of ended up finding those points of connection between them.
So you're typing and typing, and the manuscript is finished, and this is your 4th book. And now the book leaves your nervous hands, and it comes to Sarah. Sarah, what happened next? How did Sarah Crichton get Sarah DeVos?
Well, because I was enthusiastic. I got it. The manuscript came to me from. I didn't know Dominic's work. I didn't know his agent, and she sent it out to, I guess, a bunch of people, because agents usually do that. And with novels, I tend to, you don't sign up a novel. If you're an editor or a publisher, sometimes people think that novels are sold with sort of a partial or a couple of chapters or something. But you really need to see the whole book to see if you want to sign it up, because a number of books will start off well, but they don't have an ending. And nobody, you don't recommend books to your friends where you say, oh, I read this, you should buy this book. The first half is really great. It falls apart at the end, but So you need to see what the whole thing is. And I took a bunch of manuscripts. I was invited to my sister's house out in the country over Labor Day a couple of years ago, and took a bunch of manuscripts with me. And in most cases, after about 5 pages, I wasn't very interested. And then I picked up this book, which at the time was not called The Last Painting of Sarah DeVos, but I just started reading. And if you look at the first paragraph or the first couple of pages of the book as it's published, that's what was there. And it's one of those fabulous moments where you're just hanging out and you're not expecting anything, and you don't know the writer, and you don't really know what this is about because it just sort of shows up. And you're completely hooked by the first paragraph. And then over the course of the long weekend, I just kept, I didn't get out of bed, or I'd wake up in the middle of the night and go, well, wait, what happens next? And I'd go back to reading. And at the end, I sort of the breakfast table where my sister and her husband were, and I said, I've read the greatest book. I'm really depressed. And they said, why are you depressed? And I said, because I love this book, but that means probably somebody else is going to have it, or they're going to buy it, or it's gone, or there's something wrong with me. I mean, and anyway, long story short, I did get the book. There may be things wrong with me, but not when it comes to this book. And, one of the things that's so much fun is when you sign up a book that you are so excited about. First of all, the editing is such a pleasure because you get to read it again and again, and you this book did not need very much work. I felt that most of my advice had to do with the ending of the book, was to make the end of the book strong, because I do think that that's really key. And Dominic pulled that off wonderfully. But when you're an editor and you're enthusiastic about a book, you can also get your publishing house enthusiastic, and then they can get booksellers enthusiastic, and then everybody's happy.
So you've had a remarkable background to become Sarah Crichton Books at Farrar Straus. In fact, you could say you were sort of born to the role. You're the shoemaker's daughter. And can you tell us a little bit about your rather remarkable childhood and your father and your mother?
Well, I come from a family of storytellers. And so as an editor and as a publisher, I love a great story more than anything else. And my father, my father was a novelist named Robert Crichton, not to be confused with Michael Crichton, who was a second cousin and more successful than my father, but my father was a better writer. And my father wrote, among other things, he wrote a huge bestseller in the 60s called The Secret of Santa Vittoria. And he also wrote a book called The Camerons, and he wrote a book called The Great Imposter. But The Secret of Santa Vittoria still, Sarah Crichton Books, for a while there, my brother and sister and I kept thinking, it's a shame that our father's books aren't e-books. And they said to me, can you find somebody to publish, our father's books as e-books? And I thought, yeah, I got to figure this out. I'm a publisher. And finally, one day I turned around and I said, Sarah, you're a publisher. You can publish your father's books on ebooks. So if you go to Amazon, you'll see just incredibly ecstatic ratings for The Secret of Santa Vittoria and The Camerons. But anyway, so my father was a novelist. My mother was the first female documentary producer in network television, and then went on. She never went to high school. I mean, she went to high school, but just for a couple of years. Didn't go to college. Had 4 kids by the time she was 25, and through a long, complicated way, became really one of the major documentary film producers in the country. And there, so I came. Her storytelling was. And then she started a series called The American Experience for public television. And so a lot of her challenge was taking very interesting and important topics, but figuring out how to tell them in such a way that they could really reach a broad audience, but never talking down to an audience, never watering anything down. That in fact, the American audience was hungry for smart and interesting stuff, as long as it was excellent. And I still meet, I was at a party a week ago, and some filmmaker came up to me and said, your mother was so tough. And I loved her so much because she expected so much from everybody. And similarly, so between the two, I really was raised both to look for the story, but also to expect a level of excellence from all of my writers. And if the writers I work with aren't interested in aiming that high, I'm not a good match. But when I worked with Marie on Apples and Oranges, a memoir about her relationship with her brother, that was a superb book, and one which Michiko Kakutani called one of the 10 best of the year. And it was a very difficult book to work on because it was very painful and close to her, and didn't have a very definitely natural shape to it. So you have to work carefully with the writer to help her find her way and to be supportive of pushing her and getting it to be excellent. In the case of Dominic, I was lucky enough to find a truly natural storyteller and just sort of help him find the shape, especially when you have 3 stories going on simultaneously, weaving them over 3 different time periods, so that it's completely effortless and organic. And also one other thing, that making sure that that the characters of all the different time periods are convincing within their time periods, and that's something that he does so well. But as an editor, you're sort of looking at that. So these are all sort of storytelling challenges in all their different
But, you know,
pieces.
Stara, it's so unusual and exciting when an actual world-class editor comes to a literary festival and will tell a little bit about the secrets of the trade and some of the writers that you've worked with. So when you were at Little Brown, when Sarah was at Little Brown, she's much too modest to say this, but Sarah signed up Malcolm Gladwell for the first time for The Tipping Point. And there's a kind of fascinating backstory of how Malcolm Gladwell became Malcolm Gladwell. And this is a bookseller's tale as well.
Well, you know, Malcolm nobody knew who Malcolm Gladwell was. I mean, he had been writing for the Washington Post, and he was just starting to do some pieces for the New Yorker, but he was not this famous person. But the other thing that it's easy to forget is he made the phrase "the tipping point" famous, but nobody knew what the hell the tipping point was until he made it famous. And so he had written this fantastic book, and I had known him for years, and I was very excited about the book. But I had a boss who really was not keen on subtlety, and if you remember, the cover of The Tipping Point just has a book of matches, you know, I basically got fired over that jacket, and Malcolm at the time, he now speaks to huge audiences, and I don't know if you've ever seen him speak, but he's quite soft-spoken, but he really knows how to command attention, and he really knows what people are interested in and how to hold attention. But back then, he had never spoken to an audience before, and so I thought, here is a book with this sort of obscure image on the cover, an obscure title, and an unknown person. I would introduce Malcolm to our sales force at the sales conference so that they would then sort of get a handle on who he was. And he bombed big time. He kept talking like this, like nobody could hear him. And people would ask him questions, and he would stare at the ceiling, kind of, you know, and he made no contact. And I went, oh my God, we're doomed. And in fact, we were, because the booksellers, your sales force has to go to the booksellers, who are absolutely key. A book disappears if it doesn't have the support of the booksellers, and you guys don't know about books if it isn't for the booksellers, and so nobody was ordering copies, nothing was happening, and this thing was going down even before it was published. So I turned to him one day and I said, "Okay, Malcolm, let's put The Tipping Point. Let's see if your theory is right about The Tipping Point. Let's see if we can make this happen." And about a month or two before the publication, I said, "Okay, we're going to go to like 14 major cities in the country, places with good independent bookstores."
But this is incredible. This never happens pre-publication. Amazing.
The one thing I knew that Malcolm could talk to small groups of people. So I said, we're going to have not talk to large groups, but we're going to have like a really good dinner party in each city. You were? Oh, cool. Oh, that's great. I'm so glad. And so I would invite like the coolest booksellers and a couple of key media people.
Yeah,
and we would drink a lot of wine and have really interesting conversations. And lo and behold, first of all, everybody wanted him to come back to their bookstores. They all upped their orders. The media in the local places all decided to write about him. And the tipping point started being a bestseller in local places long before it became, this big bestseller. And but that was huge amounts of fun.
So this is such destiny that the two of you are next to each other. So, Arsen, did you know what was happening? Tell us about that night. Do you remember that night?
I do. I mean,
where was it? Here?
It was in Denver.
In Denver.
And I was invited with probably a couple people from Tattered Cover and a couple media people. And I didn't really know Malcolm Gladwell. I'm a pretty big New Yorker reader, so it's possible I had stumbled over an article or two of his before that. And so, we had dinner and we had lots of wine, and Malcolm did great that night. And it sounded like a fascinating book, and it's kind of, it had a real pop appeal. There were a lot of these really interesting anecdotes, so he could tell them as little stories. And you thought, well, this will work, and I don't know if people have been to our store, which is, just a few blocks away. We have that big section of recommended books. And I thought, if I just put that on that wall, I bet you people will just thumb through it and they're going to love the book. And so for us, it did take off pretty much immediately. And so, but those pre-publication dinners do work. There was one for Charles Frazier before Cold Mountain, and also Leaf Anger before Peace Like a River. So every now and then a publisher will take that chance, and if it's the right author and it makes a big impression on the booksellers, suddenly you're seeing that book, big in our store, big in Tattered Cover, big in wherever else you go, and that can be a tipping point.
Well, your bookstore is particularly wonderful, and we sent in a spy yesterday to see how the last painting of Sarah DeVos was, and there's a sign up right on the display saying this is the best book I've read in a year. Who writes this?
That was a staff member.
She's no longer working there.
I know, that was a staff
Hope
member.
it's not because of that recommendation.
I know, that was a staff member, and the other thing publishers do is they try to get us what are called advanced reading copies. So a few months beforehand, we had an advanced reading copy, and this woman named Laura was a really good literary fiction reader. So I handed her the book and said, "Will you give this a shot?" And so she loved it, and she wrote the recommendation, and we put it up on the wall, and it's sold very well. People really enjoy it, and also I think people will come back for those. There is a personal connection. If you read that book that Laura recommended, maybe you'll come in 2 weeks later and read another one she recommends. So, but it's another kind of behind the scenes things going on between publishers and booksellers that they're trying to get these books in our hands through these reading copies. I was alerted to that one because Sarah was probably high on it and let our sales rep know. So when it got to me, the sales rep said, "No, this is one you got to get somebody to read."
I know the magic of how books get made and the destiny steps, I just find such an interesting subject. And one of my favorite magic stories that involves Sarah's eye is the day that a young 22-year-old refugee is brought to her office. And out of this Sarah, can you tell the story?
Yeah. I also had the great fortune to work with Ismail Bea, who had been a child soldier in Sierra Leone and wrote a memoir called A Long Way Gone, memoirs of a child soldier.
How many of you have read this book? It's sold millions of copies, and it's taught in colleges.
It's in every middle school, high school, college now. Ishmael is the most radiant person you've ever seen, and yet he had been when he was 12, there was a civil war in Sierra Leone. His family, parents and two brothers were murdered. He, for several months, had to survive in what he insists on. He does not like calling it the jungle. He calls it the forest. And he survived, and then he was picked up by government troops who handed him an AK-47 and huge amounts of drugs. And basically, overnight, he was speeding his brains out and turned into a child soldier. And did that for quite some time until he was picked up by UNICEF troops and rehabilitated. And he had written, I knew his adoptive mother in the United States was actually here last year. Her name was Laura Sims, and she does stuff through UNICEF, and she knew somebody at UNICEF whose brother was a literary agent, and so they made this connection. And Ishmael had a 600-page memoir, which was sort of impossibly long, and was all over the place. But we began to work together, and I knew a couple of things. I knew that, first of all, there had been reportage about child soldiers, but there hadn't been what the experience, there wasn't a one-person account. So this was very rare. If we could get this into shape, it was very valuable and it was rare. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I knew that, sometimes American audiences, they're seen as not being interested in international stories, but in fact, they're extremely interested if you can sort of edit them and put them in front of them in a way that is accessible, which is, again, not talking down to anybody, but it's a different matter. And I knew that in the schools, it was very valuable to have a book about from a boy's point of view, because there are a lot of books for girls, but there aren't that many that speak to boys. And the other thing too is he had a very important message, which was, he said, I said, why do you want to do this book? Because once this comes out, everybody's going to know that you killed people and you were involved in atrocities. And he said, first of all, I want people to read this so that maybe people can put a stop to this. He said, and the other thing is he said, everybody talks about the lost boys of the Sudan or the lost children of, he said, we're not lost. You just have to find us and we need some help. And his point was that people can be rehabilitated. And a large part of the book is about his rehabilitation. And the last interesting, I can talk about this endlessly because it was one of the most important experiences of my life. But just as I was getting the book into shape, I said to our academic salesman, the one who handles all the academic stuff, I said, boy, do I have a great book for you. This is a fantastic memoir, beautifully written. And he said, okay, fine. It's got to be 200 pages long. And I said, I can't. It's like 600. I'm getting it down to like 350. He said, no. It has to be really short. And at first I was upset because I said, people have an attention span. They can read a longer book than that. And he said, yes. He said, but it won't be assigned in courses. If you want it assigned in school courses, nobody's going to do it if it's going to take up a whole sort of semester. It has to be read in a couple of weeks.
Budding
so
authors,
that's your goal.
Take note.
So we got it down to, I think it's like 240 pages. But that's one of the reasons it's as short as it is. And that worked. It's now sort of a classic in the schools.
And there's a marvelous editor-writer moment that involves Sarah attempting to feed young Ishmael every time he comes to her office with a buffet.
Yeah,
Sarah, take it away.
In these 600 pages, so here he is, he's 12 years old, and he's starving. Most of these pages is all about how hungry he was, and he tries to get a coconut out of a tree, but like some animal grabs it from him, and it's just the mother in me I just like lost it. And so he would come and work with me every Monday at 10:30 in the morning. That's our appointed time. We would work from 10:30 to noon. And I would put out this huge buffet on my desk. Just incredible amounts of food. And I'd say, Ish, eat. And he would say, I'm not hungry. I had breakfast and it's not time for lunch. I kept saying, Ishmael, really, eat. And I didn't know what I was doing. But a couple of years later, we were on a panel together, and he explained to people, he said, he was on a panel and I was in the audience, and they said, what was it like to work with your editor? And he said, well, it was okay, but she kept trying to feed me all the time. He said, and I really wasn't hungry. He said, and then I realized, oh, she's just thinks that I'm still that boy in those pages, and she wants to take care of me. And he said, once I figured that out, I thought, okay, I'll let her take care of me. And I thought, oh, thank you.
So this was a process, and I'm so fascinated, Dominic, by your process. How did you start, and what's the room that you write in? And describe your writing day. What does a Dominic Smith writing day feel like?
Well, it starts early. I get up at 5 a.m. and I have a little studio in my backyard. It's 10 by 12. Originally, when I had it built, I thought it would just have books and a desk. Mm-hmm. And somewhere along the lines, there's an elliptical machine that appeared in there that my wife and I actually both use, and my kids sometimes. But so it's a little cramped. But I go out there. It's nice to have a separate space. There's a little commute from the back of the house out to the studio.
This is in Austin.
Yeah, this is in Austin.
And what neighborhood?
In Travis Heights. So it's
so nice.
south of the river and close to South Congress. Mm-hmm. And we have a small house. It's a 1935 bungalow. There really wasn't a room where I could work in the house, so I had this studio built. And it's great to have a separate space. Some writers talk about wanting just like the bare minimum and kind of a blank wall and nothing pretty in sight. I like a kind of balance. I mean, it's definitely a room that I designed, and it feels like a place where I can be creative. And I often describe the process as akin to, I'm not a runner, but I know lots of runners. And they all talk about like the horrible first mile and what it feels like. And there's not a morning that I go out there where I don't feel like, basically, I don't want to write. There's all this resistance. There's not a lot of voices in my head, but it just feels like, it's not quite drudgery, but it doesn't feel like inspiration. It's just work.
How do you keep yourself on the chair?
Just pure discipline. I mean, I've been blessed to have writing discipline since, I tried to start writing as an undergrad, and I would just schedule it. And I have come to see over time that really my sense of it now is that we think we have to have inspiration before we can go and do meaningful creative work. But actually, if you just go do the work, inspiration will come out of the work. And so it's just kind of showing up, going through the horrible first 45 minutes, drinking the right coffee, and then things start to, you enter the flow state. I mean, things start to happen, not always, you're going to go back to those pages the next day and think a third of them are terrible.
Do you put notes on the wall? Are you like John Irving? Do you write your ending first? I mean,
I use a whiteboard, actually, and especially with the Sarah DeVos novel, because it was weird. I'd never worked with a structure that spanned so much time, so many different storylines, and
so much information, so much education about forgery and about Dutch painting.
Right, and so I had to really think about it almost as like collage. How do how do the chapters, if you move from a chapter in 17th century Amsterdam and then you land in a chapter in Sydney in 2000, what do you do to make it feel like those chapters create pressure against one another, but also like you're not entering a different book in the contemporary time period compared to 17th century?
And that you feel cinematic, because one of the themes of the book is the curse of this painting on a family that held it in New York for 200 years. So you're moving a Mobius strip that is really so impressive. I'm fascinated by your experience with different editors and editing styles. I mean, we've had the joy of working with Sarah, innovator, creative, but tell us about your editors and how they vary.
Well, one thing I'll say about Sarah is that she actually, as an editor, reminds me of a theater director. I took some theater as an undergrad, and I remember being in the hands of a very skilled director. One of the things that they do is they know not to be very prescriptive, and they know not to describe how to get to the end product. What they do is they talk very much actually how artists and writers talk, which is they talk about moods and atmospheres and how something feels. And they don't really tell you how to go change that it's more suggestive, and that for me, I've worked with a handful of different editors. That's a great way to work because it puts faith in your own process and your vision, and then you kind of work it out and you go through different iterations. And I think that's a great skill. And when you're in the hands of an editor like that, you're blessed. Sometimes you get a litany of very prescriptive edits or tactical edits, and sometimes those edits assume what I think of as the lowest common denominator reader. Like it's almost like this idealized reader who just can't connect the dots without being reminded which dots are actually out there. And so I think that's something that a lot of writers struggle with.
So it's really about pacing, and pacing is such an interesting concept. You've been a Michener Fellow. You've been in writing programs at the University of Iowa. For all the budding writers in this room, do you feel that a writing program is helpful?
I think it can be, but I don't think it's necessary. For me, it was really 3 years to write, and I treated it like an apprenticeship. And so if you approach it from that perspective, and you just need time to write and get better at this thing, I think it's useful. But I've sat through a lot of workshops where if they're not run the right way, they can kind of spiral out of control, and sometimes that hurts aspiring writers, and they get kind of paralyzed. They feel like they can't take risks.
So we're often told that readers have no attention spans left, that Tolstoy couldn't publish War and Peace today. Every publisher would turn it down as a slog. But then we have the success of Elena Ferrante's 4-volume master novels about her life. So Arsen, I'm going to turn to you on this one. What are you feeling about your readers? Are they needing haiku pages and highly paced thrillers with a lot of white space, or can they handle text?
Well, we're kind of, being in an independent bookstore, and being in an independent bookstore in a town like Boulder, which is a town that's very educated, people really are seeking out information or knowledge or curious and the creative. We don't sell those books that are lots of white space very well. And you see books, like The Goldfinch was a big, big book. Marlon James's recent book was another door stopper. Sometimes I feel like the books are either 200 pages or they're 600 pages, and you kind of find a hard time in between. But I'm always amazed by the amount of these kind of longer books that are being that are being sold and being read, and I think you mentioned Tolstoy. Tolstoy, it's a great story, and great stories I believe are always going to sell, and people are going to say, I read this amazing book, about this woman who had an affair, and and people will be like, really, and then they would buy it. I still think there's a great need for stories, and I think I think with the books, that's continuing. I also think in movie and TV watching, the whole binge thing where people will watch 12 or 13 episodes in a row, that's a much longer story arc. That's mirroring what you've been able to get in novels for years. And so somebody that really is into that and wants to watch 13 episodes at once is your reader that is going to be willing to read a 600-page book, I think.
Yeah.
Well, Nicholas Carr is here this weekend, and of course he's going to have a lot to say about our neurons firing. Do we have the attention? We can watch a screen, but do you think that we can stay with a page, or do we need that book on a screen or as an audible book?
Well, I think that gets tougher. I think that I spent a lot of the summer with my nephews and nieces who are all teenagers now, and the screen has its own distractions. I think the screen is going to be very problematic for books because, if you're on a screen and it's not just a dedicated e-reader, which most of them aren't anymore, your email pops up. There's all sorts of distractions that pop up.
Right.
And that's not true in books. I was thinking about this the other day. Books don't even have advertisements in them. You don't even have, you don't turn to page 218 and see a Coca-Cola ad even. Books are really meant to keep you in the book. And so as we move forward, I think it is important for younger people, when you're educating younger people to think about this, because I think that people can I don't think we're going to lose the attention span. I don't think our neurons are going to change in one generation. But if you've trained yourself and you're constantly answering that email or that text or like this word in this book reminds you of you want to go see this Taylor Swift video, whatever, and everything's at your fingertips, that becomes a problem. That's a lot different than lying on a couch with just a book. And so I think that will erode over time, but I don't think people aren't capable of it. But we've got to figure out what we expect from younger readers, or what does a book mean? A book with pages, I think, is a different thing than a book on a screen.
And I also think that, it's amazing the way that we can remember something that we read 20 years ago in a book where you go, wait, it's on the upper left-hand corner, or it's about 2/3 of the way through, and you can go to your shelf and pull it out, and you can find that passage that meant something to you. 25 years later, I don't know how we do this. And I do read stuff on screens, but where does that get stored? It doesn't get stored in that same way. You can't go back and find it, which I think is a real loss.
I want to spend a moment before we go to questions talking about the art of collaboration. Sarah, you had a stunning experience working with Marianne Pearl, Daniel Pearl's widow, with Mighty Heart. Can you tell us a little bit about Marianne and what it was to do this book?
Sure. This was Marianne Pearl's husband, Danny Pearl, had been kidnapped in January of 2002, so right after 9/11, and they were in Pakistan, and he was at the Wall Street Journal reporting on Al-Qaeda. And then he was beheaded in February or March of that year. And Marianne was pregnant at the time, and I'm a publisher, but another publisher went to her while she was pregnant and said, "We'll give you a lot of money if you write a memoir about what happened." And so she said, "Okay, give me the money." And then, of course, she was too shell-shocked to write the book, and came to the United States with her baby. And so I was free at the time, and so we started to work together. I said, "Okay, I'm going to help you write this book." And we had this incredible. She had her baby in the other room a lot of the time, and we would sit in. I live in Brooklyn, and we sat at two different desks. And she's a Buddhist, so she would start the morning chanting in one room, and I would be going over what we had done yesterday. And then we would sit side by side, and we would have decided every day what we were going to do. And she was going to write certain parts, and I was going to write other parts. And she could only write in French. So she would write in French, and I would write in English, and then we would break for lunch, and I would fix a proper lunch. And my then husband was a writer. He was around the corner. We would all sit there and have a real lunch, because I like to feed people, as you can tell. And then we would go back to work. And some days she would just lie on the ground and cry, and that was okay. But other days we were very serious. We did very serious journalism, and I'm very proud. I'm very proud of the book. We would quit at 6:30. We would open a bottle of wine, we would eat cheese, we would discuss what we had done that day, and she would go home and take care of her child, and then we would plan what we were going to do the next day. She would go home. A jazz musician in Paris would translate her stuff from French into English. The next morning I'd get up and push them all together, and then the next day would go back. And we did that for about 6 months, and we were the first people to say that it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who had killed Danny Pearl. We broke all sorts of news. So it was both a fantastic collaboration, but it was one where it was important to her, it was important to me, because I was doing something important, and I was also helping a lovely human being. And I've had a lot of, one of the great things about being in books, you always think of writers and people talk about what a solitary thing it is, and it is, but but it's also the great thing about being in books is it's a hugely collaborative effort. Getting down to, it's a collaboration also the books with the readers. I mean, it's all these relationships, editors and writers and booksellers and the people who design books and the readers who read it and then write the writers. And it's really exciting.
And finally, the star who plays the main character, Angelina Jolie, who brought Mighty Heart to the screen. So my question before we throw it open to the audience, to Dominic, is who is going to be, who have you cast as your movie?
I think it needs to be Kate Blanchett.
Kate Blanchett, okay, absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Got a soft spot for a
Absolutely.
fellow Australian.
And I hope you're writing the screenplay.
No. I mean, there is. It looks like there is an option that's going to happen, but I don't think I would throw my hat in the ring for the screenplay.
Okay, question. First of all, thank you. And what was fascinating, wonderful.
I'm wondering, how did Long Way Gone get its title?
Ishmael wanted to call it many very beautiful lyrical things, and be like the moon, things like that. Anyway, somewhere in the book, he just says, "I was a long way gone," and I plucked that out. So.
Sometimes the editor and the author may not be totally in accord, and yet it can work out. I think I read that The Hour of the Land is long listed for the National Book Award, and that you, as I understand it, you and Terry had some things to work out. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Terry Tempest Williams, Hour of the Land. I gathered she had a great event here, and I love Terry, but Terry, we had huge battles, and if you've ever seen her, Terry loves everything, and everything is beautiful, and and I'm a New Yorker, and so Corinne just says, cut it out, and it's like all these adjectives. It's like, and the other thing is, but the thing is that ultimately, and also frankly, she's from the West, and she would write about. We had a lot of fights. She wrote a lot about Native Americans, but it sounded for East Coast ears, it sounded hokey, and so a lot of it would be me saying, okay, Terry, this is what you want to achieve. It's sort of like what Dominic was saying, but you're getting in your way, and this is getting in your way, and but also that was a case where we had some real misunderstandings too, and that's what happens too, because writers, it's they are putting themselves out there, and they're so brave, and they're so raw, and sometimes you come stepping in, and you could be too tough sometimes, but and then there's a misunderstanding where you're human beings, and it's particularly hard when you're editing at long distances, because you don't get to see in somebody's face that you've hurt their feelings or that they're not understanding. So, and also we do a lot of stuff by email. And as we all know, emails can be easily misconstrued, or the tone is just off, and you can go get a long way gone. So yeah, we had some really big battles. And lastly, the other thing is, I really wanted that book to be shorter, and it's over 400 pages. And I had to lose that battle, and I'm sort of sorry that I did, because I think that's getting in its way a little bit, because it's a fantastic book. I'm really, really
and
excited
Sarah
by
can
it.
be a really tough editor. I'll tell my one little personal story here. Is when we were in the last stages of Apple and Oranges, I'm an obsessive worrier, an obsessive re-editor, an obsessive, I don't want to say that, I want to say that. So I kept sending these little things to Sarah. On page 28, we got to take, and I finally get this rocket email from Sarah that said, "You are like a woman who gets too much plastic surgery. You're just ruining this manuscript. Now stop it." Next question. Who has a question?
When you work with
That is such a good question. I don't know if people in the back could hear it, but it was about when you're working with somebody where English is not their first language, to what degree do you, quote unquote, correct the language, and to what degree do you make sure that the spirit of their language comes through? And I've dealt with that quite a lot, and that is a real struggle. And because, to give you two different examples, I worked with Madeleine Albright on her memoir, and even though she speaks, perfectly, she writes as if Czech were her first language, and so there's a sort of a and that doesn't really work. So in that case, I tried to make that go away. But with Ismail Bea, the confusing thing, I also worked on a novel with him, and Ismail did not go to school from the time he was 10 until he was about 16. So there are certain times when he just makes grammatical mistakes. But there are other times when he's using kind of a pidgin English because he's writing about Africa. And there are other times when he's just having his own lyrical, flourish. And, there are certain times where when he says he put his pant on, does it mean is that pidgin English? Or does he not know that pants is plural? Or is he going for some effect? And you don't want to be insulting. You don't want to stop all the time and say, you do know that pants is plural, don't you? But, you do want it to sound, you want to capture the music of the book. And so, yeah, it's each time it's a very, you don't want to just file everything down to a perfect, boring finish.
Women who've had too much plastic surgery. One last, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
What are the chances of the work of an unknown writer getting your attention?
What are the chances of an unknown writer getting your attention?
Oh.
That's a good question. Yes, I was going to ask Sarah the same, which is, does anything ever get bought from the slush pile? Just like an unknown writer.
Truthfully, no. And personally, a number of years ago, I wound up having to protect myself, and I just said something which I thought I would never say, but I started just saying, unless it comes through a literary agent, I just can't look at it because I got sucked into hurting people's feelings and crushing dreams, and I do that enough anyway, so.
One more question.
So Dominic, how do you find agents?
Well, because editors like Sarah use agents as a filtering mechanism, which is probably a good thing. I mean, people say that it's harder to get an agent than it is an editor in New York. I don't know if that's strictly true. The best way I know how and how it happened for me is that someone reads your work who has an agent, and they provide a kind of personal, they call up their agent, they get excited about the book. It's tough, though. I mean, mostly writers are, sending blind queries and query letters to agents. They're all getting the names of agents from friends or from the writer's market. And they're sending out, sometimes dozens and dozens of pitch letters to try to get an agent to accept maybe the first chapter. Right?
So would you suggest blogging so that an agent could see a writing style? Because often writers are discovered just through extraordinary blogs they've done that have a lot of an original voice.
Yeah, when I've taught creative writing and I get this question from students, I actually tell them to go to writers' conferences and meet agents and meet other writers and just not be pushy about it, but just make those connections, because it does make a huge difference. And one thing that's constant in New York publishing is no one has time to read, and yet everyone has to read a lot.
Yeah.
So they're all reading at night and on weekends. No one reads in the office, whether it's an agent or an editor, which as a writer, you kind of have this idea that somehow your editor is sitting in this beautiful Manhattan office with a couch and your manuscript, in her lap.
Like in the movie Genius.
And it just doesn't look like that.
No.
So, yeah.
Thank you, panel. Excellent. It was just wonderful.